a radical expansion of Article 2 powers by the Trump administration or their efforts to do that. That's where things get really interesting, and you never know where John Roberts, Amy Coney Barrett, to a lesser degree, Brett Kavanaugh are going to go into the rule books.
Yeah, on the National Guard, I actually, maybe I'm not a lawyer. I don't think that's that radical because I remember a couple of instances where Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, during the Civil Rights Movement, federalized the National Guard of Alabama in order to enforce civil rights laws. So,
and by the way, those governors did not want that to happen either. People say, "Oh my God, the president can't do this." When a governor doesn't want them to come in, they never heard the tape recordings between the Kennedy administration and the Southern governors.
Exactly. They made George Wallace step aside from the schoolhouse door so the University of Alabama could be integrated. So that I understand. Can you withhold already appropriated transportation funds because a state isn't doing what you want on cooperating with ICE? I don't think you can do that. I'm not sure that even this Supreme Court is going to agree that a president can do that. That's a bridge too far.
And Joe,
Yeah.
oh, sorry, if the power of the purse goes to Congress, and even though Congress has emasculated itself, it's still Congress that has to make this decision, not the executive branch.
Okay, Virginia parents, here's the one conversation you need to have with your kids. It takes one tiny speck of fentanyl to kill a person. And it might be in one fake pill, or in one vape pen. And just one pill or one hit can contain enough fentanyl to kill you. In a recent survey of Virginia teens, 60% said they were offered pills or powders in the past year. So talk to your kids about fentanyl. It only takes one conversation to save a life.
A number of the nation's largest newspapers, and I don't say this lightly, I have a huge amount of respect for the media, but a number of the nation's largest newspapers made an age-old mistake today. They took the birth of the Trump administration at face value and spit them right back out to the American public without context, without much of anything. Here were some of the headlines this afternoon. Here's one from the Wall Street Journal. Trump-Iran decision to come within 2 weeks. From the Washington Post, Trump says he'll decide on Iran strike within 2 weeks. And from the Associated Press, Trump says he'll decide whether the U.S. will directly attack Iran within 2 weeks. Now those headlines all stem from what Caroline Levitt read today at today's
You need
White
2
House
weeks to
press
prepare your family, I guess.
Now, regarding the ongoing situation in Iran, I know there has been a lot of speculation amongst all of you in the media regarding the president's decision-making and whether or not the United States will be directly involved. In light of that news, I have a message directly from the president, and I quote, "Based on the fact that there's a substantial chance of negotiations that may or may not take place with Iran in the near future, I will make my decision whether or not to go within the next 2 weeks." That's a quote directly from the president for all of you today.
I will make my decision whether or not to go within the next 2 weeks. That's
So if he alone even in the world.
all of that in isolation. It was from another White House. It makes it sound like the current president wants to give himself and his advisors time to really consider. I mean, one of the most serious foreign policy decisions a president can make. Wants to be clear, maybe, to the public that they can expect a decision from him in 2 weeks. That would be under a normal presidency. And sure, I guess there's a
And next thing
percentage
you're gonna
chance
have
of
to
what's
order
going on this
I'm
side.
telling you, that's a,
The very
just to keep us
that is
Yeah.
completely
quiet.
missing, no surprise from Caroline's announcement or statement or reading of the statement, and all those headlines is this. I'll get to it in 2 weeks, is one of
My line
Donald
too
Trump's
much.
absolute favorite tactics. He
Yes.
surely uses it all the time.
They know him too
And
well.
most of the time, in fact almost every time, when 2 weeks rolls around, Trump has either completely forgotten about whatever it was he promised in
Yeah.
the first place, or, and I think this is more likely than the first one, he's hoping people have just moved on. That the news cycle is on to something else. Maybe something else he fabricated. Maybe just something else in general.
You know, why they could have put somebody who like to lie to him for?
6 months since he took office. 10 times.
We're gonna be sending letters out.
And that's
in
why
about
I
a week and a
said,
half, 2 weeks. I can't tell you that, but I'll let you know in about 2 weeks. Within 2 weeks, I could answer that question better in 2 weeks. I'll do this at some point over the
Why
next
2
2
weeks?
weeks. I'll announce it over the next 2 weeks. I'll tell you about that in a month from now or 2 weeks from now. President, you know, in about 2 weeks. You can ask that question in 2 weeks, and we'll see. It'll be out
we
in
have to
about
ask again.
less than 2 weeks. We're gonna start selling hopefully in about 2 weeks.
About 2 weeks. About 2 weeks. Maybe it's a tick. Maybe he read a marketing report that says people move on in the media. Who knows? But the point is, the tactic that Trump is using on almost every issue, from his fake timeline around Russian-Ukraine peace negotiations to his made-up timelines around big trade deals. Where are all those big trade deals, everyone? To his issuing visas for high-skilled immigrants. Claims it all is coming in just 2 weeks. Respect us. And honestly, it's a bit maddening that this tactic can still spark headlines like all of the ones I read earlier. Because it's not new. He did the exact same thing throughout his first term in office.
We're going to be announcing something, I would say, over the next 2 or 3 weeks.
I'll be making a big decision on the Paris Accord over the next 2 weeks. We are coming out with that plan in 2 weeks.
Oh yeah, cause some is using our line.
You'll be seeing that over the next 2 weeks.
Over the next 2 weeks.
And it doesn't have to be today. It could be tomorrow. And it could be in 2 weeks from now.
Could be in 2 weeks from now. Could be in 2 weeks. Notice the pattern there? It's a big pattern. I could honestly spend half the show just showing you clips of Donald Trump promising to do something in exactly 2 weeks. You can Google it. There's lots. That he never ended up doing. And we've kind of known about this forever. I mean, this was the headline from Bloomberg less than 6 months into Trump's first term. Here it is. Quote, in Trump's White House, everything's coming in 2 weeks. So what should we
We are
actually
concerned.
take away from Trump's 2-week deadline on Iran? Because that's what we're talking about and dealing with now. Well, one likely possibility is that Trump doesn't want to have to make a decision about this at all. He just wants to keep punching it down the road. He doesn't have speculation, pay attention, but he doesn't want to actually commit to a decision, and it's not hard to see why.
Businesses across this country are bracing for an immigration crackdown. Today, the White House border czar Tom Homan said the administration will continue its reign at work sites, including farms and hotels, but he did clarify that arresting criminals comes first. Now, I want to be clear. There is not a business, not one that I cover, big or small, that is advocating in any way for illegal immigration. But what we do have in this country, from our dairy farms, restaurants, fisheries, meat packing plants, to our small businesses, to our biggest multinational corporations, is a plain and simple labor shortage. And these are often low-paying, physically grueling jobs, farm workers, roofers. Nearly 1 in 8 of them are undocumented. But I want to also understand that they're also entrepreneurs starting businesses and hiring people. They're part of our communities, contributing to the growth of our economy. They pay billions in federal, state, and local taxes, not to mention paying into Social Security and Medicaid programs they're not even eligible for. And the fact is, businesses have been advocating for something. They've been advocating for comprehensive immigration reform for years and years, to find ways to bring workers into this country legally. But unfortunately, we do not have a system yet that can actually process them in a timely and fair way. And since this very public ICE raid situation started, well, you know what we haven't heard? We haven't heard about any companies that are saying how they are filling those jobs with American citizens who've been waiting in the wings to work an 8-hour shift cutting chicken parts in a 40-degree meat locker, or wash dishes for hours and hours in a local diner. Immigrants are a key part of the engine that keeps America running. That has always been the case, and it is part of what has made our nation so successful. So if we care about growing our economy, about making sure we have food on our tables, roofs over our heads, from the people I speak to in the business community, they say rather than spending all of this time and energy on deporting people or arguing about not deporting people, let us all find a way to collectively make this work. Former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance joins me now. She spent 25 years as a federal prosecutor. Joyce, before we get to that, we do have breaking news tonight. We just learned in the last few minutes. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals is siding with the Trump administration and allowing the president to keep control of the California National Guard that is deployed in Los Angeles. What do you think? Just walk us through this decision, what it means, and what happens next.
Right, so this is the 3-0 panel decision from the Ninth Circuit that had been widely predicted. The panel, during oral argument, made it pretty clear that they believed that the Trump administration was entitled to deference, and that the president's decision that he could federalize the National Guard to help him enforce the laws of the United States was something that would stand. So this stuff is another one of these cases that we're at a very early stage in. This isn't a final decision on the merits. This is another decision about injunctions and what the status quo will look like while the litigation moves forward. The status quo here is that President Trump retains control of the National Guard for the 90-day period that he federalized them during, and now the litigation proceeds.
All right, well, let's talk about these raids. What do you make of Tom Coleman's comments that raids on work sites will continue, but they will prioritize criminals? Right? They're not saying they won't go for others, but criminals, they will be their top picks.
Well, look, the Justice Department is more than capable of handling criminal aliens in this country. In fact, that's a mainstay. It's one of the largest tranches of cases that federal prosecutors do annually, and it's been that way for a couple of decades. There's statutory law that lets you prosecute people who illegally re-enter the United States after being deported, and when those people are violent criminals or gang affiliated, they're enhanced penalties. So that's bread and butter work for federal prosecutors. That's not what's happening when ICE is out at job sites picking up workers, or when it goes to parking lots to try to find people who are looking for day labor work, or when it goes to schools. And so I think, this is one of those cases where there is politics and then there is policy. And what we are seeing is politics and what this administration thinks will make a favorable impression on voters, but it's not the kind of policy we need for immigration, which has been, I think everyone agrees, right, a broken system, a system that needed a fix. Last year, Democrats brought forward an immigration plan that gave Republicans virtually everything that they had been asking for over a decade. But Donald Trump wanted to be able to run on immigration as an issue. He urged Republicans in Congress to reject that compromise bill, and so the broken immigration system continues.
The July Work Sale is happening now. At a this pillow bed on sale $349. From the versatile cottage colors collection. Choose bookcase beds with tons of storage, or space-saving mugs on sale at First to Go Kids.
You're America's beverage companies, making American products with American workers at America's hometowns, creating good-paying jobs, the kind that require only a strong work ethic, because we believe in the promise of America and the people who make it great.
I remind you, I have the right to give orders. I'll be back. What sort of a person are you? The person who gets what she wants.
You've got a military, first responder, or government service background, you get exclusive discounts on eyewear brands like Oakley, Costa, Ray-Ban. Netflix.com. It's more than a deal. It's a benefit you've earned.
The nationwide broad resistance against President Trump's agenda is growing measurably. We saw the No Kings protest with over 5 million people across 2,000 cities and towns, and the media covered it as it happened, which undercuts some of the other narrative in D.C. especially about a supposedly weakened or exhausted Trump resistance.
Demonstrators gathered in large cities and small towns from coast to coast to oppose President Trump's policies.
Demonstrations spotted in Phoenix, Raleigh, and West Palm Beach, just to name a few.
Accused the president of stepping into authoritarianism.
About 100 to 250,000 protesters that filled this street.
This was a historic day of protest in the U.S. The opposition against him is big, deep, growing, confident, and increasingly unstoppable.
Growing and increasingly unstoppable, as Rachel put it. And that reflects something that we can measure. This is a big deal. It wasn't just a one-off or a one-day, even though it was quite the historic turnout for a day. And if you get out of sort of the endless sort of political narrative thing and just look at, say, how papers, people on the ground saw it, major cities and small towns, this is front page. This was big. It happened in a way that really got that local traction as the lived experience of huge gatherings far outside of campaign season around the world. Many look over at the United States and recognize this as huge civic action, something that in some countries is a more common and, frankly, sometimes more respected contemporary occurrence than it is here. And yet tonight, days later, here we are. Much of the political world has moved on. And the D.C. press, and again, like any grouping, there's caveats and exceptions, but a lot of D.C. press viewed this as a 1 or 2 day story. But is it? These protests are ongoing. And if they're just a 1 or 2 day story, the premise would be that it's somehow routine. Thing happened, tell you about the day after, move on. But right now I want to go through the evidence that states otherwise. That we are not witnessing some small or routine thing, but rather a gigantic awakening and ongoing effort to resist what are extreme, sometimes rare events coming out of Trump's White House. When I say rare, I mean seizing powers that no one's tried in a half century. Sending the National Guard, no one's tried that without a governor's approval in 60 years. Telling the Supreme Court sometimes they might not follow things, and then weeks later following it. We don't have that on the modern record, not since the Civil War. Now, if this isn't getting the right coverage, by which I mean accurate, it could partly be because the media landscape is changing. Much of the more modern new media spaces are on digital and podcast platforms, and they currently lean right. And that might be a space where the protests are not a week-long story, not something they're celebrating, maybe not something they even want to get into the day it happens. Now, a longtime media member and critic, The Guardian's Margaret Sullivan, who's worked as an ombudsman, thinks deeply about how the press works. Even before the protest, she wrote about how the media in D.C. and elsewhere sometimes ignores anti-Trump protests because the companies are afraid that prominent protest coverage will be criticized by the right as partisan. And they, the press, cannot bear that label. She also argues that not only is the problem of fear going on, which is ironically something that the protests are protesting about, right? You fear a government reaction, you fear the powerful right wing saying you're partisan, but that's what the protesters are saying.
And why is the reason for that what the government has a
She also argues that there's a kind of capitalist catering that goes on.
I can't even
conservatives have
cover
the
that
upper
track.
hand, and they did show improving numbers in the election.
Where is that aisle?
Corporate media decision makers are fearful of losing right-leaning readers and viewers, she argues.
Where's the olive oil?
So that's some of the concern from a very experienced member of the press, who's one of the big outlets, about what's happening. But honest press is supposed to be honest, not catering to a bottom line. And that takes us to another piece of this tonight. Because some of the same types of outlets, looking at another protest movement that was smaller than this one, thought it was more important, treated it as a long-term story, even with far smaller numbers than this past week. Any guesses out there? I can hear you in your living rooms. I'm talking about the right-wing Tea Party, which grew in response to Obama being elected. People out on the streets, and was treated by these same outlets I'm mentioning as a huge, big, important deal. It was treated as a political fact, almost. Strangely not talking about are the Tea Parties. For the life of them, they can't figure out what these Tea Parties are.
Thousands of activists held rallies in cities across the country. Protesters covered these and we were one of the only organizations PR.
Everything is big and
You know, 12 protesters, and that's really where it started.
So, what started as perhaps organic and then also had a lot of money from the Koch brothers and other things, got some momentum, but it also got a lot of air cover, a lot of national emphasis on the Tea Party. It wasn't isolated.
Here's Fox correspondent Griff Jenkins doing a live shot, and keep an eye on what his producer is doing. Now, call me old-fashioned. I don't think a producer should be whipping up the crowd. Glenn Beck wants to be a cheerleader for conservative protests, fine, but what you just saw amounts to choreographing the story to get people...
Tanya, let's go.
At the time, the demonstrators numbered into the tens of thousands, according to a September 2009 account in the New York Times. Now, that's a big protest. I've been to cover protests. Sometimes a few thousand feels like a lot if they're packed in and loud. Tens of thousands is certainly big. And you can cover it. But where does that compare to 5 million people in one day this weekend? Indeed, at their height, the Tea Party estimates would still have you, and we checked this today, be 1/20th of what we saw just this weekend alone. 20 times the number of protests. And remember, unlike some of that Glenn Beck stuff, the No Kings rally, shout out to some of the organizers, best we can tell, wasn't organized, but from the ground up. You did not see a Glenn Beck type on the left, let alone many elected Democrats actually taking the lead. Now, there's a broader history of this country, of course. Protests so large they could not be ignored. Consider back in the early 60s when MLK led the history-making March on Washington. And within months, there was polling that most Americans thought even a peaceful protest like that, again, there was other controversies in that era, but even peaceful protests, mass demonstrations, would hurt the fight for racial equality. We mentioned that with a note of humility. The people then, like the people now, including me, the voice you're hearing, don't know what's going to happen. We could be wrong. They were wrong because they overwhelmingly thought it would hurt, and they were skeptical of getting out there. Today, we have millions of Americans mobilized in a way that is absolutely huge. And one Harvard study, the Tea Party, showed that Republicans thought they were improving their voter turnout because the protests did bring in new people. And there's a long-running debate over whether that kind of energy ultimately was a precursor to the MAGA era, and once seen as back on its heels, definitely got aggressive. Does any of this translate to the Democrats in the coming elections? We don't know. But apart from elections themselves, we are living through something that is as big as the people involved, and the viewers, whether they're on podcasts or traditional DC media, might be missing it. Might be treating this as a 1 or 2 day thing that's not as big as the Tea Party, when if you check the numbers, at its height, it's 20 times the turnout and national movement of that sometimes very hyped Tea Party movement.
Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. The White House now says Donald Trump will decide in 2 weeks whether the United States will join Israel's war on Iran. Of course, as many have noted, when he says 2 weeks, it often just means he's not going to make a decision either way. Of course, war with Iran would be madness, and we know that, well, we can be pretty sure about it, because we all lived through the last reckless regime change war of choice in the region initiated by a Republican president. The Iraq War, of course, an unmitigated disaster, perhaps the biggest foreign policy blunder of my lifetime. Thousands of American soldiers lost their lives. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians were killed. It led to the creation of ISIS. It was a disaster for America standing abroad. The region was completely destabilized for over a decade. And here we are at home, where it really hurt the Republican Party, which led directly to the nomination and subsequent election of none other than Donald Trump in 2016. Of course, we entered that war in Iraq under false pretenses. As early as the day of the September 11th attacks, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld was working to somehow use the attacks as justification for an unrelated war in Iraq. The Bush administration lied about the connections between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda. They lied about Hussein having or imminently developing weapons of mass destruction.
We have no indication that Saddam Hussein has ever abandoned his nuclear weapons program. On the contrary, we have more than a decade of proof that he remains determined to acquire nuclear weapons. What I want to bring to your attention today is the potentially much more sinister nexus between Iraq and the al-Qaeda terrorist network, a nexus that combines classic terrorist organizations and modern methods of murder. Iraq today harbors a deadly terrorist network headed by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, an associate and collaborator of Osama bin Laden and his al-Qaeda lieutenants.
Now, that speech was based on faulty intelligence and over the objections of multiple reports of the State Department questioning that intelligence. Iraq did not have an active biological weapons program, nor did it have an active nuclear weapons program when the Bush administration used them as justification for the war. There was no credible link between Iraq and al-Qaeda. Colin Powell insisted he did not knowingly lie to the UN, and no. He later said the origins of the speech did not come from the intelligence agencies or his own State Department, but rather from Vice President Dick Cheney's office. The Bush administration wanted to exploit Secretary Powell's reputation in order to launder faulty intelligence. Well, here we are, it's 22 years later, and God, it sure looks like it's happening again. We're being told without evidence, or with faulty intelligence, that Iran is actively developing weapons of mass destruction. Therefore, war is not only inevitable, but necessary. But as it turns out, it's much easier this time. The Trump administration doesn't need a speech to the UN when they can just deceptively edit video of their own director of national intelligence saying that Iran is not close to obtaining a nuke to make it sound like she was saying the opposite. Here's what the White House tweeted out yesterday.
Providing you with a better car buying experience, CMA's Colonial Nissan takes it personally. Discover the difference an employee-owned dealership makes and experience the transparency, honesty, and care we provide every customer every mile of the way. And this month, drive off with an amazing deal on the Nissan you're looking for. CMA's Colonial Nissan. Owners just care more about you.
In the past year, we've seen an erosion of a decades-long taboo in Iran on discussing nuclear weapons in public. likely emboldening nuclear weapons advocates within Iran's decision-making apparatus. Iran's enriched uranium stockpile is at its highest levels and is unprecedented for a state with a nuclear weapon.
Sounds ominous. That sounds threatening. Here's what Director Gabbard actually said in context.
The IC continues to assess that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon, and Supreme Leader Khamenei has not authorized the nuclear weapons program that he suspended in 2003. The IC continues to monitor closely if Tehran decides to reauthorize its nuclear weapons program. In the past year, we've seen an erosion of a decades-long taboo in Iran on discussing nuclear weapons in public, likely emboldening nuclear weapons advocates within Iran's decision-making apparatus. Iran's enriched uranium stockpile is at its highest levels and is unprecedented for a state without nuclear weapons.
Okay, that's a pretty big difference, right? The critical first line. The intelligence community continues to assess that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon.
Computer on the printer.
It hasn't been authorized by the Supreme Leader.
I'm not gonna do that.
That's a pretty important context.
You did, just put in the password.
You pulled it off? I don't know how to get to settings on the printer.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the same guy who came to Congress on the anniversary of 9/11 to call for war with Iraq and who's been claiming that Iran will have a nuke any day now for decades.
Are there any other nations that you would recommend that the United States launch
You're
preemptive
leaning back
attacks
on my
upon?
phone. Watch your head.
The issue is
You're
not,
leaning back on me.
the issue is not, first of all, are there other nations that are developing nuclear weapons? Yes.
Should we launch any other preemptive attacks?
First, let me say what they are, and then let me make a suggestion on how to proceed.
Thank you.
The answer is categorically yes. The two nations that are vying competing with
I
each
don't
other
know why you like
to
to do
achieve nuclear weapons
There is not proof
is
of
Iraq
that.
and Iran. And Iran, by the way, is also outpacing Iraq in the development of ballistic missile systems. This is not
Where's the
a
bag you had there
hypothesis.
just now? Give me.
It is fact. Iraq, Iran, and Libya are racing to develop nuclear weapons. Obviously, we like to
How
see
are you
regime
now?
change, at least I would, in Iran, just as I would like to see in Iraq. It's not a question of whether Iraq's regime should be taken out, but when should it be taken out? It's not a question of whether you'd like to see a regime change in Iran, but how to achieve it.
Of course, it wasn't a fact at all. Quite famously, deeply not. The exact same playbook, right down to the letter. In 2002, Ken Edelman of the Pentagon's advisory board told Americans in the Washington Post, quote, I believe demolishing Hussein's military power and liberating Iraq would be a cakewalk. Now, Fox News is sending basically the same message directly to its biggest fan, Donald Trump.
Honestly, if we ever even got into a conflict with Iran, it would be over within 2 days, if that.
Well, if the guy on Fox News says it'll be over in 2 days, well then, I'm sure it will. It's hauntingly familiar. The only reason that Donald Trump is deliberating at all this 2-week deadline, which again, who knows about, is because there is a rift in his base with hardcore MAGA Republicans telling him, do not do this, because we promised them no new rules.
When I'm back in the White House, we will expel the warmongers, the profiteers, and take over our government.
What they should
And we will restore world peace. We're going to end these endless wars. Endless wars. They never stop. You ever see these wars? They're going for 14 years, 20 years. We will measure our success not only by the battles we win, but also by the wars that we end, and perhaps most importantly, the wars we never get into.
Oh, yeah?
That's Inauguration Day. The wars we never get into. Now he's in office, and we're already at a point where a new war has started. That was started by Israel, right? It sure looks like we're about to go to war. And here's the thing. Every single Democrat in both houses can sign on to congressional resolutions trying to block him from bombing Iran, and he wouldn't blink an eye. But he cares about angering his base.
I don't know if they're trying to get us into a war with Iran or not, America. If Israel is trying to, I don't trust the Israel leader at all.
Nope.
I don't believe anything that guy says.
Nope.
And I don't think that
thing on there. Can I go on the shop? Yes.
soldiers should
Let's leave that one
have to go and defend.
Set that time,
It
Alex.
feels like they're trying to push Trump to go do that, and it's like,